Some years ago, I was walking through Greenwich Village in New York City with my brother. It was a late summer afternoon, and the sidewalks were crowded as we were making our way towards a restaurant. My brother, having lived in Manhattan for years, walked briskly, and soon he was almost a block ahead of me. I noticed that I was falling behind because people kept coming up to me with coupons and political flyers and various requests. I would have to disentangle myself and try to keep moving. I dashed to catch up with my brother. He turned to me and said, "Just don't make eye contact and keep moving." I knew he had lost his Southern upbringing. It's a good strategy for getting quickly to your destination, but it fails if it becomes our only way of moving through life. Today we've heard some very poignant words from the book of Lamentations, a short book full of anguish and grief. Our year of the Bible has brought us to Jeremiah and this book, traditionally associated with the prophet. These words of lament and loss express the grief of the people of Judah at the destruction of Jerusalem and the loss of the temple. Jerusalem, Zion, has become like a widow as her children are carried away into exile, and she weeps bitterly in the night. Last weekend, Dr. Walter Brueggemann spoke about the Hebrew prophets. We were captivated as he masterfully drew out themes based on the historical context of the writings. And he also helped us to see connections to our own time. He showed us that the prophets stand as outsiders who are able to call out the ways in which Israel has forgotten Yahweh and become like the other empires, built on wealth, power, and oppression. The climax comes when Judah is captured by the Babylonians and Jerusalem is destroyed. The narrative then shifts to one of exile, learning again what it means to be God's people as captives in a continuing series of empires. If you think of this pattern as one of decline and then ascent, Lamentations sits at the very lowest point. Lamentations gives voice to a people whose world has collapsed. Jerusalem has become a widow, that is, one who has lost the security of a husband and the joy of children. The upset is profound. Both the present and the future are bereft of stability and meaning. Dr. Brueggemann suggested that America's parallel to the destruction of Jerusalem are the events of 9/11. He said further that though we are trying to convince ourselves that our economy is recovering and our security has improved, he sees a continuing pessimism about our future. We've lost an opportunity to ask more radical questions about privilege, power, and oppression as we scurry to rebuild a flawed system. The challenge to those of us who claim to follow Yahweh is profound, as we may be the voices from outside that see the unhealed parts of our own lives as they mirror the oppression of the world's dominant narrative. We're standing on the last Sunday of Lent and on the threshold of Holy Week, a time when we enter more deeply into the suffering of Jesus. Next Sunday, Jesus will come into Jerusalem with its rebuilt temple and its continuing suffering as a Roman colony. We'll see him confront the powers of the day, submit to their violence, and carry the cross on which he dies. We prepare our own hearts through identification with this suffering, and we pray for new life as God's great gift to us. Readings from Lamentations are part of those liturgies, including the very poignant words we heard today. Is it nothing to you, all you who pass by? Look and see if there is any sorrow like my sorrow. In the context of Holy Week, Jesus speaks those words to us, calling us to pay attention to what is unfolding before our eyes. It's a plea that runs counter to our instincts. We want to avert our eyes, to deny the pain that is in front of us. We feel helpless or angry or afraid or guilty. We want to pass by. We want to escape. Perhaps some of you, like me, are old enough to remember a terrible crime that occurred in New York on March 13th, 1964, 50 years ago last month. Kitty Genovese was stabbed repeatedly just outside her apartment. Her screams were ignored by her neighbors, and she died a horrible death. The case drew a lot of attention as a sign of city dwellers' apathy and callousness towards their neighbors. 5 books have been written about this case, with varying reports about the number of witnesses, but with almost unanimous conclusions about the failure of anyone to respond to her calls for help. A more hopeful picture comes to mind as we remember the responses to the marathon bombing last year, when many people, first responders and ordinary people, came to help the victims, ignoring the instinct to run away. As one example, the manager of Marathon Sports on Boylston Street recalls running out to see the injured and then running repeatedly back into his store and grabbing clothing off the racks that he could tear into pieces to make tourniquets to try to stop the bleeding. As vivid as these examples are, I don't want to imply that this passage from Lamentations is only about rushing to help when someone's extreme physical injury is right before our eyes. I'd like for each of us to internalize these words and broaden them as an approach to living. Look and see becomes a way of acknowledging the brokenness around us, as well as the opportunity to see hope and new life. It's not easy. We feel confused, overwhelmed, afraid, alone, discouraged. How will we find a way forward from personal losses and communal violence and dysfunction? I want to suggest that part of the way comes through prayer. Stay with me here. I know that we all struggle to pray, wondering if our words are the right ones, embarrassed when someone asks us to pray spontaneously, feeling frustrated at hurling our words and thoughts into the apparent silence. We Episcopalians are the beneficiaries of the beauty and poetry of the Book of Common Prayer. It's a treasure and also a bit of a curse. We think our words can never attain the eloquence of Thomas Cranmer and the others, so it becomes a deterrent to try to pray for ourselves. One of the most helpful discussions of prayer for me comes from French philosopher and social activist Simone Weil. She was born into a secular Jewish family in Paris in 1909. Brilliant in school despite a sickly childhood, she was always attracted to the plight of the poor and oppressed, soldiers in World War I, peasants during the Spanish Civil War, and finally the suffering of her French compatriots during the Nazi occupation. Though never baptized, she became a serious student of Christianity. These are the thoughts of one who struggled constantly with both physical pain and with the suffering of the world around her. She died of tuberculosis at the age of 34. Vey's memoir, Waiting for God, contains her writings on prayer, which she defines simply as paying attention. This seems like a simplistic idea, but for Vey it requires intense effort. Prayer concentrates our attention, creating interior space for God. It involves our willingness to be vulnerable, to recognize the evil in ourselves and in the world around us, and to allow God's presence to come into our hearts, to suffuse us with God's love. So my counsel to you and to myself this day is this: rather than worrying about the right words or the right posture or the right time for prayer, let's practice paying attention. Become conscious of those moments in which you experience a disconnect between the world as it is and the world as it should be. This may occur to you in huge ways: the staggering number of people still unemployed despite a recovering economy, the incarceration of so many young men of color, suicides of high school students, rising sea levels that threaten the poor because of global warming. It may be smaller in scale: the suffering of a family member stricken with cancer, the dissolution of a marriage, the cruelty of malicious gossip. Refuse to look away from those experiences. Take them into yourself and pay attention to your reactions. As a yoga instructor says, pay attention to your breathing. What stirs you? What energizes you? Where do you feel yourself pulled towards action? What calls to you? What causes you to stop, to look and see? Obviously, we can't pay full attention to everything. That's why it's helpful to link this paying attention to prayer. Find something that captures your attention in a way that compels you to slow down, literally or figuratively, and carry it with you. As you turn this situation or scene or concern over and over in your mind, you're tilling the soil in which God can act. By acknowledging your vulnerability, your lack of certainty, your humility, you are making room for God's power. By confronting your own blind spots and wounds and prejudices, you're opening yourself to God's healing. There's no magic formula here. Developing your own rhythm of paying attention is important. Learning to see both the suffering and the hope around you, in yourself, in other people, in institutions, in situations, requires cultivation of an attention. It opens up the possibility of seeing where God is already at work, bringing healing and new life, and then moving to join God there. Last Tuesday night, many of us attended the annual event, Bostonians for Youth, which raises money for the programs here at Trinity Boston Foundation and for partner agencies working to improve the odds for young people in this city. There was much on offer that night to concentrate our attention on the severity of the problems and the joy of lives that are being saved. Stopping to see both the suffering and the success leads to engagement of the heart and mind in seeing God at work. Being open to seeing our part in both the oppression and the redemption is an exercise in prayer. It slows us down. It keeps us from moving too fast to see what God is up to. It suggests ways and places of hope and healing. As we draw closer to the time of Jesus' passion, let us slow down and pay attention. As he himself moves towards the cross, Jesus is weeping at the grave of Lazarus, and he's offering new life to his friend. Don't miss it by failing to make eye contact. Behold and see.